Alright, welcome back to Modern World History. If you've made it this far, then you're in the final unit of the course, and congratulations already for sticking it out this long. But what we're going to do in this final unit is we're going to look at the transition to the modern world. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at a few different regions and discuss the different events that occurred within those regions to kind of bring us to where we are. Now, I know what you're thinking, and you're absolutely right. There's no way we're going to be able to do this in the kind of scale to give you a complete and full knowledge and understanding of the events of the last couple of decades. But what we can do is we can look at enough to give you a basic idea that then coupled with various articles and news and even the news of today, you'll be able to draw connections and piece it all together. Both the past, the present, and kind of how we got there in the last few decades. And so that there is my goal in this final unit. So to give you an idea, we're not really going to focus on any kind of a set outline. We're going to look at different regions and only just a sliver of the events that happened during that time in effort to connect the dots. And the last video of this unit is going to deal in the way that we're connected today, what struggles we face, and how we're going to find solutions to those struggles. So we're looking at globalization and sustainability. Let's get started. The first thing that I want to do is talk about India and Pakistan. So there's not too many countries in the world today that have nuclear arsenals. In fact, there's only 9. All right, India and Pakistan are 2 of them. And so I think it's worth noting that we already talked about India's independence movement from the British Empire. We talked about the partition between India and Pakistan, and really that's what we're kind of looking at here. Is we're going to go in a little bit more detail about that. And so just to kind of flashback, India has 2 main religious groups that have competed and compete for power. That's the Hindus and Muslims. Hindus make up the majority, Muslims are the minority. And so the Hindu majority and most people there had aligned themselves within the Congress Party, and then the Muslim League looked out for the rights and freedoms of the large Muslim minority that existed within India. And Muhammad al-Jinnah was the Muslim League leader. And one thing that the Muslim League leaders had always said was that they would even prefer a British rule to a Hindu rule. And so the decision was to partition the territory into a Muslim Pakistan and a Hindu India. And Pakistan, it just so happened, would be on both the east and the west in the purple areas that I just circled with black pen. And so you had West and East Pakistan. And we already talked in an earlier video about how this resulted in a massive scale interregional migration. When we talk about an interregional migration, it's within one country or one region. And what happens is you've got Muslims who are going to go from India into Pakistan. Okay? And then to use a different color in order to highlight this, you've got Muslims that would go from Pakistan. You got Hindus that would go from Pakistan into India. So Muslims from India into Pakistan, and then Hindus from Pakistan into India. I hope I said it right that time. All right. And as they intersected with one another, you can imagine that there would be fighting. There would be fighting that would take place, and many people lost their lives. Okay, and so even Gandhi made the point to say that he doesn't see anything worth celebrating. He sees only bloodshed, rivers of blood, or whatever it was he mentioned. And we talked about this in an earlier video. And so about 10 million people moved, and about 1 million people died in the conflicts. Now, there is an area, and I'm going to erase my graphics that I just took the time to draw. But there is this one area here known as no, that's the Punjab. Excuse me. This area here known as Kashmir. Okay, and now here's it was a particularly different situation because the leadership in Kashmir is Hindu, okay? But the majority of people living there are Muslim. And so it was difficult to decide who gets the Kashmir region because the Muslims want to control it in Pakistan and because Hindus want to control it since it's governed by Hindus. Um, and so even today, literally today, like this week, you can pull up news on conflicts in this area because they're still fighting about it today. And with both of these countries being nuclear powers, I mean, I don't think that we're afraid right now of nuclear warfare, but that has kind of been in the background for a while, especially when this first kind of erupted as an issue, because it could result into turn into something bigger. It's very much, you're walking a fine line when it comes down to sovereignty and who gets control and how we make those determinations. And so this here is a perfect example of the difficulty with dividing territory among national groups. It's just never going to be a cut and dry, easy decision to make. Modern India, the first prime minister in India was, I'm going to butcher his name, Jawaharlal Nehru. I'm just going to call him Nehru. Sorry about that, everyone. And he was a follower of Gandhi who emphasized equality and unity. And if there's I don't know if there's anything better that a leader can emphasize than those two things, especially when you live in a multinational state with a bunch of different people of different religions and ethnicities, and even classes. And so one of the things that he did was he instituted a series of liberal reforms that were designed to make life better for the lower castes. He wanted to improve industrial output and build up their economy. He wanted to stand up for neutral countries during the Cold War period because they were under the continual influence of both the Soviets and the United States. And he also worked to elevate women's status. Now, this one right here is particularly important because anytime you elevate women in society and close this equality gap that exists between males and females, you're going to have tremendous economic growth. All right, and you're going to end up putting to rest many of the problems that might exist as well, such as overpopulation or hunger or any of these kinds of things. Women are able to rise up to higher kinds of jobs and get higher education, which means they're not having children when they're teenagers, and everyone, the economy as a whole benefits tremendously when you empower women. So Nehru was kind of on the right track with that. His daughter, Indira Gandhi, would become the Prime Minister of India in 1966. And so she was the first, I believe, the first ever female Prime Minister. I might be totally wrong on that. I probably shouldn't even said that if I wasn't sure. But she was challenged by Sikh extremists in the Punjab. So to go back up here, I accidentally circled this area thinking it was Kashmir at first, but this right here is actually the Punjab region we're talking about, and this right here is basically the area where the majority of Sikhs in the world live. So remember, we were talking about our religions, and we talked about how if you look at the 5 most, I guess, largest religions based on adherence, Sikhism is number 5. All right, now there's a lot less Sikhs than there are Buddhists, which is number 4. But the point I'm trying to make is that we're talking about a good several tens of thousands of Sikhs living in the Punjab, and so this right here is a blown up image of what area we're looking at. And Amritsar here is where their golden temple is the holiest site in the Sikh religion. Alright, so Sikhism is a universalized religion that has existed since about the 1500s. And they had kind of stayed in this area, and we've already talked a little bit about them as being soldiers that supported the British during the colonialism, and they also, just having that warrior emphasis historically. They were, some of the bodyguards of Indira Gandhi were in fact Sikhs. And so she was challenged by Sikh extremists, and she sent the military to deal with them in the Golden Temple. All right, we could go into a lot more detail on that, but we're not going to for the sake of this video. And as a result of the way she handled that, her Sikh bodyguards actually turned against her and shot her to death. In hindsight, it kind of makes sense that maybe she would have considered that as a possible threat, but nevertheless, um, looking at Pakistan, it being divided geographically. That's never a good thing if you want to administer rule. And so if you take a geography class, you'll learn about state morphology, and you'll look at different shapes of states and different kinds of characteristics that make a state easy to govern, like everything being compact with a central capital, or elongated or fragmented states. And so Pakistan was an example of what we would call a fragmented state, because it's separated by geography, but you've got another state in between one half of it and another. And so naturally, if it's you're going to have difficulty sharing resources across this territory divide. And so it just so happened in this case that East Pakistan was the one that got the short end of the stick, and they just weren't doing as well as the West. And so they wanted their own independence, and they started to fight a civil war against the Pakistani government. And so the East ends up identifying as Bangladesh and would fight for their independence. India actually stepped in for Bangladesh and helped them in the civil war against Pakistan, and Pakistan ends up surrendering and accepting their independence. And so today, one more time looking at the map, today this area that is known as East Pakistan is now known as Bangladesh, with Dhaka as its capital. We're going to see that in just a moment. So Jinnah, Al Jinnah, who we just talked about at the beginning of this video, was the first prime minister. He was remember, he was the leader of the Muslim League, but he was the first prime minister of Pakistan. After him, there was a lot of weak leadership and military coups that have plagued the history and stagnated the country for many decades. Bangladesh, we just talked about, is today the most densely populated country on Earth that's not a microstate. So when I talk about a microstate, we're looking at pretty much just the city itself. Very small territory. Bangladesh is not classified as a microstate, but as a non-microstate is the most densely populated country on Earth, meaning that there is a lot of people per square mile in that country. And the more urban the area you're in, like Dhaka, for example, is incredibly densely populated. So could be thousands of people per square mile in some of these areas. So though it's getting better, the overcrowded country still faces huge problems more recently from natural disasters and also from crowded and unsanitary cities. You see, Bangladesh has been on the path to development for a very long time. They had very high population growth due to natural increase. Over time, they've reduced their birth rates and their total fertility to a point that they're at about replenishing level. And because of demographic momentum, the population is still continuing to grow there. But as time goes on, more people are achieving higher degrees of prosperity. Maybe not quite by the standards that we have today, but they're getting there, and the outlook looks better in the future for them than for some other countries. Afghanistan is this country right here. It's landlocked, which means exactly what it sounds like. They don't have any access to the ocean, which puts them at an economic disadvantage. And actually, and maybe because of that partly, they are in fact the poorest country in all of Asia. Okay, so it is the poorest country in Asia. This right here, we just mentioned in a previous unit that they fought a war against the USSR. It would have been the equivalent to the USSR's Vietnam. And basically after, in the late 1970s, communists took over in Afghanistan, but the people there opposed communist rule. And so the resistance group called the Mujahideen, or the Holy Warriors, resisted communist rule. The Soviets were bound and determined to keep their power in the area. And so they sent troops to aid in the struggle, and the Mujahideen used guerrilla warfare tactics, and after about 10 years, the Soviets finally withdrew in defeat. But what this did was, now that the Afghanis didn't have that strong Soviet influence there was a power vacuum. And the different various groups within Afghanistan began to compete for who's going to take power. And with no one to stand in the way, the strongest group that emerged was known as the Taliban. And they are an ultra-conservative Muslim group. And when I say ultra-conservative, they're downright traditional in their approach. And they built a system on Sharia law, which is the strict religious law of Islam. This would kind of be like if we were going to create a government and we used like the Hebrew law and centered on the Ten Commandments and some of the Hebrew laws and things like that in order to govern our land. It's just such that wouldn't work for today. And so what this did essentially was it stagnated the social, political, and economic situation in Afghanistan even more than it already was. They banned TV. They banned modern music and art. Women were the ones who suffered the worst. I just mentioned, as we were talking about India, that the one thing you can do to elevate your whole country is to elevate women. But women were actually they were made less than they already were by society due to these traditional laws that the Taliban used to govern Afghanistan. And so a perfect example of what this would look like would be if you get the chance to watch The Breadwinner on Netflix. I hope it's still there. I watched it. It's probably been close to a year now since I saw it. But it's a cartoon, and it highlights this the story of this girl who had to basically pretend to be a little boy in order to support her family because of the circumstances that made it basically illegal for them to exist. And so if you get a chance to watch that, I'd highly, highly, highly recommend it. There are also other videos and snips from PBS NewsHour and things like that on YouTube you can find that kind of talk to the women's oppression in under Taliban Afghanistan. Also, Afghanistan under the Taliban provided refuge for terrorists who were in line with crazy interpretations of Islam, such as Osama bin Laden. And while the Taliban was defeated by the United States back in the day, it does still remain a force in Afghanistan, which is still the poorest country in Asia. Thanks for watching.